Thank you for joining Feed the Dark podcast for our final part of the three-part series. Here we will be discussing the religious themes in the Hellbound Heart, as well as our overall concerns with the Hellraiser film. Thank you again for tuning in.
We talked about how Clive Barker, was gay during and this was during the 80s. So usually you'd probably be under the impression that this might be a critique of religion, especially because of, where religious people in public generally, uh, you know, tend to stand on those issues, especially with the heavy BDSM imagery here and all the overt sexuality. But it's not really, at least in my reading, it wasn't too much of a critique. Like a lot of sins got punished accordingly, and there was a lot of religious imagery in the Cenobites, which I know you kind of expressed before. You don't know if they're good or bad or indifferent, but still, I mean, I feel like it wasn't as punishing, but still, this is like filled with religious imagery, and the film, even though I'm not as obsessed with it, for like specific shots which are just call straight back to the Bible, which I think is kind of interesting. Only because, yeah, like I said before, I don't think it's like bashing it, and so what do you think about that?
So I think the incorporation of religious elements in, this book and in the movie itself, Clive Barker being the person he is, I know by now nothing is by accident in any of his works. And to have the overly religious themes and how the Cenobites in the novel particularly are, described as dressed as if they were priests, these long black gowns. Everything was a gown and, very ornate black leather. It kind of left me with the description of like, that's almost like a priest's robe. That's like something that a priest would wear at church. And, even more so in the film adaptation, like you said, a lot of these scenes were pretty much shot for shot, kind of like they were from the Bible. And especially once you get to the end of the film and you get to Frank's final torture scene and that very famous line, Jesus wept. And right before he gets ripped to shreds, and I cried as a child and didn't want to watch that scene, but oh well.
If we find video footage of that, we'll have that as the intro and outro for this episode.
Yeah, I feel as if it's definitely not by accident that all of that religious imagery made its way into there. Specifically, I think for a couple of different reasons, not just to, kind of outright mock or kind of jab at organized religion or the church in particular, despite the fact that, during the 80s, a lot of churches were, really not on board with people coming out as gay. They were not on board with people kind of experimenting sexually and kind of feeling okay with their sexuality and exploring different avenues of, what pleasure could mean to you. And a lot of organized does frown on that. And, especially earlier on, like only a few decades ago, like a lot of things were considered a taboo that are not considered a taboo today. And I feel like Clive Barker was very ahead of his time in tackling those subjects and blurring the lines between how having a Cenobite that has kind of made this figurehead of this pleasure principle and what the meaning of pleasure is, and their entire purpose in life is devoted to this pleasure. To have them dress as a priest is kind of, you know, flipping things around and kind of showing how, you know, these people that are into what they're into, that have their way of life, that are happy with where they are, they have their purpose, they have their source of pleasure, you know, they're not different from the priests. They're not different from these people that would consider themselves saints, because these people in their minds are saintly unto themselves. And I feel like it kind of, you know, Clive Barker just has this way of blurring lines and kind of, you know, at least in my opinion, you know, bringing things together that shouldn't be put together to prove a point. And I feel like that's what he did with incorporating religion into this work that he did, because, you know, having these kind of depravities and these exploits of pleasure portrayed as religious experiences, I feel like is just perfect example of, you know, what it was like during that time, you know, to kind of be going through questioning your own sexuality, to questioning, you know, should I come out, you know, is now a good time maybe, and, you know, things like that, and the certain prejudices that people had. To have this kind of portrayed in a religious aspect, I feel like is empowering in a sense. You know, I feel like it's, you know, if that was me, I would just have this sense of power, like, wow, you know, look at this. The character in this book, you know, is this omnipotent being and, you know, all powerful, and is also, you know, aligned in this way of life that I am. And I feel like having the Cenobites as that figurehead of both religion and, you know, that source of pleasure at the same time, kind of unifies how some people do get that same source of pleasure from church. You know, you have religious enthusiasts, you have people that go to the extremes and depravities of what religion has to offer as well as their source of pleasure. You know, anything that can get us out of ourselves, that can, you know, kind of open up that door to fill that hole that we have inside that we want. You know, all those desires that we have as humans, anyone could, I feel, view as a source of pleasure. And I love how Clive Barker chose to incorporate religion as one of those, because, you know, having that desire for something, you know, so strong, even as religion, you know, can be, you know, like people say, too much of anything good can be something bad. And, you know, I feel like having religion so closely tied in with the Cenobite's definition of pleasure, um, kind of, you know, wraps that up as, you know, even religion can be viewed in this way, you know, even humans can be viewed in this way, you know, anything can be viewed like that. And I really love the fact that he chose to include that in there.
Yeah, no, me too. That's really one of the things that elevated this novel slash novella. I know I keep saying that, but I can't really decide which one. It's what really elevated this work of fiction for me, because it would have been so much easier to just include religion in a negative way, but the gray area in which he, you know, explores those themes is, it really provides room for more of an analysis and more of a discussion, I think. So yeah, I'm glad you really went into that. So I guess with that, is there anything more you want to talk about the movie? Because I have some things that I would like to throw in about the film, but I had some issues with. I don't know if.
Oh yeah, no, feel free, man.
Okay, cool. So I guess where I first want to start off, and I know you agree with me because we've talked about this before, because we are friends, in case you guys missed that, is the soundtrack. You want to get
Oh yeah.
out of it? Yeah, that could have been so good. Ugh.
Ugh. I mean, obviously, we're both very big metalheads.
Mhm. I don't know.
Cannibal
Give it,
Corpse
give it
and all
away. Yeah.
Elvins. But
Yeah, I got Slipknot as a my normie metal. Yeah. If you're 13, you'll like
you
this shirt.
know, having Coil almost do the soundtrack for this movie, I feel would have made me um dislike the movie overall a lot less. You
And just
know,
real fast, they're an industrial band, correct?
yes.
Yes, over. Yeah.
So for those of you that haven't listened to Coil, they're very much like the Pretty Hate Machine era of Nine Inch Nails. You're still getting a lot of elements of synth pop and kind of dungeon synth, along with what would later become defined as industrial metal, the incorporation of the heavy amplified guitars, the bass, the almost robotic drums in the back, and they just have such a haunting way of what they do with industrial music as a sound. And I feel like having that incorporated into the movie just would have fit so well, especially, I mean, since for those of you that do not know, industrial metal is very closely aligned with the whole BDSM and kink and, kind of underground sex community. So having that kind of a soundtrack to that movie, I feel just would have made the most perfect sense, aside from having Trent Reznor score your freaking movie. But
Yeah.
yeah, he wasn't doing film scores back then, but he is now. So.
Thank God. Yeah, that definitely would have added a much more, or it would have really added to the tone of the film. I mean, this is back when American studios, I guess, were a little turned off by the fact that they would have to include more of a European sound. So they vetoed that decision, and they thought it could use more of a classical aesthetic for some strange reason. I really don't get why, especially rewatching this. I'm like, I don't know who the hell thought this lined up with that, but I don't know that I've knowing that information and rewatching the movie, I was like, what the fuck? Whose decision was this? But that
Hey.
really threw me off. But also the special effects, I go back and forth on because like there's some stuff where I'm like, because it's pretty much all practical because it's the late '80s. But and there's some stuff where I'm like, oh, this gore effect is really cool, and there's other scenes where I'm just like, I feel like the claymation at the end of Evil Dead 1 was more convincing.
Yeah.
Like,
So like having the first scene and the every shot that they use of like the hooks that the Cenobites have going into flesh, is such a powerful shot for me that like done practically the way that they shot it just sends like a chill up my back every time, and like, oh shit, I can feel that spike going in.
yep.
But then you get like the last scene of the movie where Frank is like stretched out and his face looks like freaking Gumby or whatever, and like just again Evil Dead 1 claymation, like I think that was better than that. Or like the freaking Butterball Cenobite, the one fat guy with the tiny glasses and everything, the practical effects on him sometimes, it's so weird seeing someone in a costume like that, and then you see Doug Bradley as Pinhead, and you're
Next to
like,
a
okay,
human thumb.
so
Yeah.
he clearly got into makeup first, and then they spent the least amount of time on that guy.
Yeah, the giant human thumb was not really as intimidating.
Oh
Maybe
yeah.
when I was younger, but actually the thing that I thought you were going to talk about, which I said I forgot, was the dragon at the end of this movie. That kind
Oh
of,
my
I don't
gosh.
know what the fuck happened there. So yeah, so we mentioned that the ending was different. It wasn't just that the Cenobites let Christy go. It was that okay, so I guess they end up inside the box somehow, and there's a dragon that flies. And I don't know what the fuck happened. Do you remember exactly what happened at the end of this film?
Yeah.
I just remember it
So
incorporated a dragon that looked like it came out of like a 1970s,
they're
cartoon.
to run away from the Cenobites because at the poorly ending of the movie, the Cenobites decide to chase Kirsty out of the house. And when Kirsty goes to leave the house, is when the Cenobites have this kind of dragon, pterodactyl, skeletal. I don't know what the hell it is, but it's one of the worst practical effects in the movie.
It's explained
Um,
nowhere.
and yeah, it's in absolutely no other scene. It only exists to confuse you more at the end of the movie, as they clearly tried to rush the ending and just make a bad guy as quickly as possible. And this dragon just chases Kirsty down the street until it takes the box, and then that's it. And Kirsty steals them all away, and nothing is explained. There's a dragon in the Cenobite lore now somewhere, and that's it. It was just too much confusion than it was worth. And actually a fun little tidbit on the note of practical effects. There's that scene in the movie when Kirsty's in the hospital, and I forget the name of the character, but that like weird demon thing that chases her down the hallway in the hospital scene.
It's
I
not good.
forget what they decided to name that monster, but there's one particular spot that you could pause the movie on, and you could actually see two dudes wheeling that creature thing down the hallway from behind it, and you could see their shadows. And I don't know how that made it into the final cut of the movie, but it is there if you want to go find it.
That plus the chomping noises it makes is just, it's not
Oh,
not my favorite scene in the film. I think it's
there's
it did not age well.
something about the 80s movies when the creatures would be making that chomping noise, but the mouth would not be an animatronic, so
Oh yeah,
it
it's
would
like
be
Mount Bolgia.
chomping, but the mouth would be moving.
It's like Mount Bolgia from Spawn. If anyone else gets that reference.
Oh my god.
All right, so that was I was gonna ask you what your ratings were on the movie and the book before we get into that, because I know there's so much stuff to talk about here, but I'm sure I'm even forgetting stuff. But was there anything else you wanted to add to either one?
I mean, you know me. I can not just talk all day, but talk about horror all day. But
Same.
I I feel like we did a pretty good job summarizing this. I don't think there's really anything else that I would add. We hit all the key points. Religion, BDSM culture, coil, how amazing Doug Bradley is, and
Oh yeah, his amazing voice. Oh, I guess there was one thing that I would regret not mentioning is just that Clive Barker kind of reminded me a bit of Rob Halford from Judas Priest, just in that he was, he was a gay person,
oh,
or is a gay person in the metal community, but he didn't come out until I don't think the 90s, but he sort of popularized the whole, leather and metal culture. And I thought that was a kind of a cool, I don't know, I guess.
yeah. No, I do get a lot of Rob Halford vibes from the Cenobites here. Rob Halford clearly kind of immortalized in the metal community the whole bikes, chains, and leather kind of like subculture of heavy. And I don't know how it took people so long to not realize that Rob Halford was gay. I mean, like you have songs "Ram It Down,"
Yeah, looking
"Grinder,"
back, it's kind of, yeah.
Yeah. But all joking aside, I feel like what Rob Halford did for the, homosexuals in the metal community when he came out, here he was, this kind of badass, take no prisoners kind of biker dude who was fronting one of the biggest heavy metal bands at the time to come out, I feel like is just such an empowering thing to see, someone that you look up to. And if you were gay in the metal community as well, to say, wow, if he can do it, why can't I? And I feel like it's the same kind of thing with Clive Barker in the horror genre and the macabre, and just kind of seeing, like here he is, openly gay and, still making, if not the same career for himself, but an even better one. And, I feel like as a reader and as a fan of his, having that knowledge kind of gives me a better insight into his work. There's things now that I wouldn't really pick up on in reading any of his works that I would have if I had not known that, he was gay. And, I'm sure it's the same thing for fans of Judas Priest, delving into Rob Halford's lyrics. I'm sure you can see the kind of symmetry of where his stance in life has an effect on the words that he carefully chooses to include in certain Judas Priest songs, like Turbo Lover, for example, like perfect commentary on, Rob Halford's sexuality. And I feel like Hellraiser is kind of that same kind of love note that Clive Barker put out there before he decided to come out. And I feel like it's really just, such a well put together, not just novella, but commentary on, deep down what it was like to be gay in the 80s. And I feel like Hellraiser just kind of sums up everything together like that, if you look a little hard in the pages.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. That's why, that's why I found those two situations analogous, especially because, we're around the same time. I mean, I know Priest was 70s and 80s, but yeah, no, I thought it was kind of cool that, being a metalhead and a horror fan, that those things happened around the same time.
Oh
But
yeah.
I guess now we should get to our ratings. So what would you, I guess first I'll ask the book. If you have a rating out of 10? I'm trying to think of mine.
So the book, I love the Hellbound Heart. It's one of my favorite works of Clive Barker's, but it's not without its flaws. There's a part of me that wishes it was longer, but there's also a part of me that is so content with, the pacing of it and how in your face it is, and then it's over. It's like going to a heavy metal show. You're there for an hour and a half in a mosh pit, and then after an hour and a half, you're just standing there sweaty with your shirt ripped open, like, what the hell just happened to me? And that's what I feel like reading the Hellbound Heart was. It reminded me of that. And, based on that feeling alone, I'd give it maybe like a soft 8.5, maybe a 9.
Mm-hmm.
But the movie, I would definitely say, is maybe a 5 or a 6, somewhere around there, maybe a 5.5.
You're stealing my ratings before I give them. Jesus.
Oh man. I love the
It looks
book,
like I'm
but
copying
the
you.
movie, the movie, I feel like if Doug Bradley was not in that movie, it would receive like a 1 or a 2, just like completely dumb. None of the plot made sense. The soundtrack didn't fit the movie at all. The acting was super cheesy and very, like you said before, like Hanna-Barbera cartoonish, like with their facial expressions. And the movie was a mess. But Doug Bradley alone, at least once watching that movie, I feel like it's kind of like a rite of passage in the horror genre. You have to see Doug Bradley play Hellraiser. And, oh God, play Hellraiser, play Pinhead. I mean. But, yeah, I feel like, just his voice and his acting alone made that movie, what it was. And, I would really only give it a 5 or a 6 because of him. Everyone else in that movie can go to hell. But
Yeah, no, this is frustrating because I, agree entirely with your ratings. Although I should say, just put my own spin on it. When I first finished this, I probably would give it more of like a 6.5 out of 7. It wasn't really until like it messed with me, but it wasn't really until I put it down and then thought about all the things that we just discussed here, where I was like, oh wait, that actually had a lot of interesting things to say, and it was probably a little bit deeper than I gave it credit for. I think the first chapter really threw me off the first time I read it because it's the first chapter, and I was like, "What? Wait, what the fuck is going on?" kind of thing, and that kind of put me in like a terrified daze throughout the next couple hours that it took me to read this. But no, now I'd give it around I guess 9. I think just because of how much he packed into this less than 200 page novel, I guess if you want to call it that, Clive Barker. But yeah, and the movie, yeah, same thing. I guess like around a 5, maybe even like 4. I know it's a classic
Oh,
among horror fans. I don't really give a shit. I mean, I put it on to rewatch for this episode, but yeah, I don't know. I don't really see myself turning it on too much for other reasons, even though it is close in like plot beats, but it just the execution is not really my
yeah.
thing. I much prefer Candyman if I'm gonna watch a
Oh
Clive
yeah.
Barker movie. Yeah.
Oh, without a doubt. And I mean, like, having them not choose to include Coil in the soundtrack, I mean, look at where we are with, like, European horror movies today.
Mhm.
It's like we're getting completely shut out in America. Like, there's no competition with stuff like Midsummer. Like, absolutely ridiculous, to not want to include more European elements in the movie. But, oh well, you live and you learn.
Yeah.
The Europeans are making great horror now, thank God. Very good.
Thank God. Yeah. And A24
Yeah.
has provided some great American filmmakers like Eggers and some other people. But
Yeah.
actually, I did have one more question before I forget. Do you have any book recommendations that you would recommend to fans of the Hellbound Heart?
Well, I brought it up earlier. If you are a fan of the Hellbound Heart, I would definitely recommend reading Clive Barker's Books of Blood. It's a compilation of around roughly 300 pages, but it has about 30 short stories in it. All of them are generally 20, 30 pages long, very short and precise, but they give me that same feeling each time I reread them that the Hellbound Heart did. That short kind of punch to the face of what the hell did I just read? And, seeing what Clive Barker could accomplish in under 200 pages in the Hellbound Heart, it's even more interesting for me to see how he tackles a similar amount of subject matter in just 30 pages or less. And, it's just one of those books that there's so many different themes, so many different short stories. They had that really crappy movie with, what's his name? Bradley Cooper, The Midnight Meat Train.
Mm.
Where he's like hunting a butcher on a train who's murdering people, and it's like one of the worst horror movie adaptations of like a Clive Barker book ever. But that was actually one of the short stories in Books of Blood. And there's another movie, Dread, I believe is on Netflix now, which also was a short story in that book. And each one of them, you have short stories that are dedicated to, here's a bad guy, here's some gore porn stuff, someone getting their head chopped off, whatever. Then you have ones that are just pure fantasy, like wizards and fairies and stuff like that. And you have ones that are just very modern day, ones that are kind of possession stories reminiscent of like The Exorcist. And to see him kind of get into each kind of different theme of horror like that, it's really amazing to see how he tackles it so differently in one book. So definitely recommend that. Also, if you're a fan of comic books, Lock and Key, which I think is now a Netflix TV show,
Third
amazing.
person to
Read the
recommend this to
comic
me,
book.
actually. On this show,
Oh,
you're the third person. I really got to pick that up. Yeah.
it's really awesome, and it kind of gives me that same feeling that Clive Barker does. I mean, Joe Hill, horror legend, Nosferatu and horns and everything, but
Heart-shaped box.
Lock and Key just kind of had that childlike innocence to the characters, and they're all teenagers and kids in the book, but to incorporate like a huge amount of like love and horror around like these children that are struggling with adolescence and growing up and finding out who they are. And it's just really such an amazing read. It's full of fantasy, full of horror, and full of like super awesome macabre themes throughout it. So definitely recommend that.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, man. I do want to check out Books of Blood as well because that's like, at least according to the internet, the pinnacle of Clive Barker's collections. Although probably will get to, I do want to read A Magica first, only because I feel like my uncle will kill me if he finds out I read more Clive Barker before the textbook he gave me like a year ago. So, but thank you so much for coming on, man. I really do appreciate it. I really want to have you on again, maybe to discuss either another Clive Barker story or to discuss something else entirely different. But this was it's a fascinating
Sure.
conversation as always, dude. I mean, we always do in person, but to actually have this on film for my show is it's awesome. I love it.
Hey, anytime, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm happy you're doing this, and it's nice to have a forum to talk about horror. This is
Oh,
really
my heart.
a
Oh,
lot of stuff that I do in kind of my own time, my private time. I watch scary movies, I read scary books, and it's not very often that I get to partake in, conversation about this kind of stuff. So, it's really an honor and a privilege to, be able to not just be on a podcast, but to have a friend to talk to about this kind of stuff. So,
thank you, man. Oh man, my heart just warmed up so much. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jared. Before we go, I guess is there anywhere that you'd want me to plug for anyone to find you, or do you not have that thing set up yet?
I do not have a thing set up yet,
Okay,
but
cool.
you can find me on Facebook at His Dudeness,
Mm,
and for fans of The Big Lebowski. And yeah, thank you.
awesome. All right. Well, once again, this has been Feed the Dark podcast. You can find me on YouTube, Libsyn, Apple Music, and Spotify. Have a good one, guys and girls. I got shit last time for.
Thank you for joining Feed the Dark podcast for our first 3-part arc. Comment below about film adaptations you may not have been too thrilled about, the music that you listen to when you read books, and scores that really stand out to you in your favorite films. You could find us on YouTube, our Google site, Facebook, and Libsyn. Thank you again.